Yeah.
And also that you don't believe in the auteur theory, that you don't see yourself as an auteur?
It's not that I don't believe in it. I think
I don't believe in it. But.
Well, I don't believe in it as being something which is innately desirable or admirable. Look, is Wes Anderson an auteur? Yes, he is. Absolutely, he is. His fingerprint is everywhere. Are lots of people who are called auteurs not auteurs? Definitely. There are very, very few auteurs.
Maybe anyone who would call themselves one is not.
I do find that the possessory credit, a film by, and then the name of the director, I think is almost always untrue and always extremely offensive to the people who are actually involved in the filmmaking, who did a lot of the filmmaking and are just being ignored by the kind of grabby vanity of the director.
It's such a collaborative. Every student who comes to the film school comes in thinking they need to direct, right? And we spend 4 years trying to help them understand collaboration, right? The heart of all the filmmaking.
It is what it is. If a DOP was not an important part of the creation of the aesthetic and the filmmaking, why would production companies fight over DOPs and say we've got to have this one or we've got to have that one?
Yeah. And I mean, I think increasingly the folks who could help you in post with visual effects and color and everything else, right, is the kind of digital substrate of film so shapes everything that's part of it.
Yeah, there's a kind of all sorts of spurious, I mean, aside from auteur theory, all sorts of sort of spurious notions get created about what is right and wrong in film. You know, it is right to shoot on film and it is wrong to shoot digital, or it is right to use practical effects and it is wrong to use visual effects. And there's an awful lot of that is bandied around and kind of used as badges of honor in some kind of way. And it doesn't really make any sense to me. I think you are working within a medium that has an awful lot of options available to you, and then you use the options that are correct for that project. There's nothing, if say Ex Machina had been shot on film, which it wasn't, it was shot digitally, I don't personally believe it would be a better film for that,
I don't either.
in my opinion.
I'm going to talk also about another thing I see in your films that probably has much to do with my origin into cinema as someone who was looking at film through the lens of gender, right? But I want to talk about women in your films and the role of gender in your films, right? So I think unlike your first film, this film is not thematically or overtly about gender, but so there may not be specifically an argument about gender in it. I've seen you quoted saying that, but making a sci-fi film that centers on 5 complex women characters, really can't not be about gender in the moment that we live in now.
Yeah, I mean, when I said that, what I was really doing was refusing to be engaged in a debate about gender. I mean, I've got lots of things to say about that, and I'll try and limit it.
We have plenty of time.
There's a lot of thought about gender in Annihilation, but it is specifically about the deliberate absence of an argument. And if I were then to make the argument, it would be undermining the way the film is constructed, which relates to the absence of the argument. But I'd say something else, which I think is truer, or not, or equally true, I don't know, which is that we're not born with an understanding of everything relating to anything, and gender would be one of them. I mean, but it could be any sort of social issue, and really what happens is as you get older, you think about things more and you learn more about them actually, and so I think sometimes there's a sort of assumption that is made about people, which is that as you start, you should know everything and not be getting anything wrong. And I think that's difficult and unlikely.
And kind of boring.
Yeah, and it's just an unreasonable request because it in a way it states that age 21 you know as much as you do age 81, and that's simply not going to be the case. And something in the process has to happen, which is learning, thinking, observing, and so on. So in the case of gender, say, I can see an evolution of thought processes in what I'm working on that isn't finished yet. And in a way, I have to leave myself the right to make mistakes and get things wrong. But then also hope that I or anyone else will think about those things and then adapt how one does it in the future. So I'm a little bit worried about sort of crystallizing any arguments in aspic or in crystal rather, and just making it part of a thought process. It's one of the things that really, it's probably the wrong city to say this in, but pisses me off about Twitter is the way it kind of locates people to thoughts that may have been glancing. And in fact, it relates to what we were talking about, watching films at different points in your life, or when I think about the thoughts that pass through my mind over a given day that I might not attach myself to even 24 hours later. There's something kind of problematic in this, I think. So in a way, what I'd want to say about the gender, the use of gender in films or books or anything I've worked on, is that it's part of a process. And it isn't fully defined at any point. It's a big issue at the moment because of Time's Up and you know, pay gaps and all sorts of different things, all of which are correct. So I'm being slightly circumspect in the way I'm talking about it. But
no, but I love
get
the
it.
way you're talking about it. I think that the polarized nature of conversation in the U.S. right now
not just the U.S., it's everywhere.
Has so much to do with our inability to understand or care for nuance or shifting or changing attitudes, right? As if you're going to just attack people in Twitter, you don't give anyone a chance to learn or reflect or change.
You don't, but I think that's true. I also think that so often the statements that are made really are more reflective of the anxiety of the person making the statement than, you know, the poor bastard who's getting hammered.
And we had these kind of conversations, you know, it's easier for some of my students to talk about gender than about race, and it's because many of them are white and don't understand even their own whiteness as racial, and are so afraid of saying the wrong thing that it stymies the conversation because they haven't given themselves the space to make a mistake and learn and move forward. So it's very refreshing to hear you talk about working with gender through those lenses. I mean, you've made 2 films that very much center...
Can I just say something? Just to have said it. On the 2 films thing, I think what you're doing, and I mean this with respect, is falling into the idea that only the director is the maker of the film. Because I think that, say, if you write a screenplay, or if you film it, or you edit it...
You've had some other films.
It's important to acknowledge it, I think.
It is important.
And I don't mean that to take stuff, I actually mean it to distribute the filmmaking role to a group of people.
That's fair.
Sorry.
So I think making a film like Annihilation that features these women in kind of complicated roles and not being about gender is maybe the most is a very feminist kind of filmmaking, right? That it doesn't have to be about gender. If it has women in it, it could just be about women in their complicated lives. So I appreciated that.
What one would like, I mean, very broadly, I shouldn't exactly use this word, but sort of the ideal would be that if you were, if race or gender or any of those kind of attendant issues were involved in a narrative, they would not be the most significant part of the narrative unless they were specifically about that thing.
It's like Get Out is about race, and I loved it, right? And it should have been about that. Yeah. But I don't think any film that has women prominently featured in it has to be about gender, right?
Or the use of any number of different ethnicities is the defining thing.
Right.
That you are just casting it that way, or you are, you know, with race, gender, or whatever it happens to be.
Although there is the really great moment in the bedroom scenes in this film when Lena kind of mocks Kane for imagining she just sits and pines for him when he's away, which I thought was very nice. That was a very nice touch. But maybe we could, you know, use that kind of discussion of gender as a hinge to go back to Ex Machina and talk a bit about gender in it, right? So I will confess that as a feminist film professor, right, when it first came out, I thought, oh no, not another, you know, hot fembot movie, you know, with a Pygmalion theme, right? I thought perhaps I was done with those. But then I saw it, right? And it's definitely not another, you know, boys with their lady robot toys movie. It's, I think, if anything, maybe a feminist fairy tale. I think it's got some very sophisticated, this one, arguments about gender, if not in the second. So what do you think? Is there...
It's got two sort of overt things relating to gender, I think. One is where gender resides. Is it contained within a form? Is it conferred on you by someone else? Does it relate to a physical form, or can is it ascribed, or is it prescribed, or whatever it happens to be?
That's super feminist right now, by the way, right? That's like we're hanging out in feminist theory at the university right now.
Okay.
You can come to that class too.
The other thing was just a sort of game it plays, which was as much to do with objectification as anything else. And I've got a question in my own mind about whether objectification does reside as squarely as we all say it does in women, or whether objectification is broader than that. But in very, very simple terms, what Ex Machina does is it poses a question to a character, a young man, and therefore also poses the question to the audience, which is, does this female-appearing robot have an interior life? That is basically the question. And at a certain point, the robot makes itself look more and more like an attractive woman in her early 20s, and at that point the young man stops asking the question, and so does the audience, or a lot of the audience, you couldn't say everybody, and the moment of objectification has happened. So then, when the robot does indeed turn out to have an interior life, people are, to an extent, certainly the young man is, and a proportion of the audience are then surprised. So it is that sort of handover at the moment of objectification. The caveat to that is that really what it's saying is that we can look at people and not ascribe them an interior life. And I think actually that is done very, very commonly. We're very kind of self-aware that it happens to young women because it's talked about a lot. But actually I think it happens, for example, with old people, say. There's an awful lot of assumptions that are made about other people's interior lives that are not true. And I think a lot of it is to do with the way we're trapped within our own interior life. So there's a lot of objectification happening. But that was that was where that film sort of centered itself.
And the film also uses systems of looks very interestingly. So, you know, it's obviously about the surveillance by Nathan of everybody, but Chiyoko's character is so fascinating in it, and the kind of thoughtful, careful quality of looking that is ascribed to her character. So there's a shot that, you know, with her looking over the monitor,
that's right.
And then her watching as Ava finds the, you know, kind of closets of fembots. So.
And her interior life as well.
Yes, and her pivotal role in the plot. Right? So
which relies on having had an interior life.
Yes, and
which has not been ascribed to her previously. I would suggest in an instinctive way. I think one of the things that is frustrating for me sometimes is that the behaviour and intentions of characters is confused with the intentions of the people that were making the film. That
we also teach that to our students. You should just come teach, right?
Nah.
And to really kind of understand that what the characters are is maybe what the film is critiquing, you know, or what the film is pointing us to see, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be able to do that, or every character must be virtuous.
Yeah.
Which is pointless.
Yeah, and not also boring for
Very
filmmaking. Yeah. So, I mean, this film also seems beyond what it might have to say about gender to very much be a film about the world we live in right now and the city we're in and what it spawns, right? So it was, I think, prescient to have Blue Book sort of predict what we now know to be the forces driving kind of data collection in the world, right?
Yeah,
so,
I'm not sure it was prescient in as much as that it's never been a secret.
That's
the,
true.
the thing that
we
really
sign it when we click.
Yeah, although of course no one reads that, but we also know. We know.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm in a way more interested in is not the identification of what data is being harvested and used by tech companies. It goes back actually to that word I used earlier, which is amnesia. Edward Snowden gave an enormous revelation about an awful lot of stuff, and the important thing, it seems to me, is that nothing happens.
Right.
That we just sort of drift through it and we forget it. You have a president now who would never, ever, ever have been able to survive his election campaign with some of the things he said and did in a previous era. But amnesia is part of the currency here. Nothing really matters. Nothing seems to have consequence in a way that I find really disturbing, truly disturbing. I mean, it takes you down a route. Like, it's always worth remembering what bad shit we can get up with. You know, I mean, everyone always thinks back to the Second World War. You don't have to go that far back at all. You could look at Rwanda or Yugoslavia or Cambodia. These things are attainable. You know, they are reachable states. And the way they are stopped from being reachable states is by stopping them. You know, so. Yeah,
it's absolutely true. So I want to talk a little bit about your future direction and then open it up to the audience for a bit. I see that you're moving to television to expand your transmedia empire, from novels to comic books to video games to film to TV. What attracts you to television?
Partly a long-form medium, but also that very broadly, but I also think correctly, television is at the moment the home of adult drama. That is not to say there isn't fantastic adult drama being made within cinema, like Get Out or Moonlight or whatever it happens to be. It absolutely happens, but television is broadly much more welcoming to it. And in the 1970s, you had Taxi Driver on cinemas, and now you have Breaking Bad at home. And so it's something to do with that. It's something to do with hoping that at the moment I deliver a narrative that we've all worked on in the group, there isn't a kind of anxiety response of what the hell do we do with this, but actually the people you're delivering it to think, good, this is what we wanted you to deliver. That's the hope.
And what are you watching right now?
What am I watching right now?
Or recently that left an impression?
Recently, Handmaid's Tale. I thought it was fantastic.
Where is it going to go in the second season?
I don't know. I'm looking forward to finding out.
Yeah. Because they finished the book.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating, really beautiful.
Yeah.
There is something that I got obsessed with recently and I've now forgotten. I'm the amnesiac.
Amnesia again. Maybe we could turn the lights up a little so we could see the audience and see what questions they have. There they are. Any questions for Alex?
I'd like to know what role those 5 women play in the narrative of Annihilation to the Moroccan zone.
I missed the second part of that, sorry.
You were suggesting that more than you were responsible for the role in the movie of Annihilation, and I wanted to know what the 5 actors contributed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in essence, what happens is you write the character, you've got your own thoughts about them, and then you really do hand the character over to an actor, and they have their own decisions. It's a version of the same audience or reader relationship with a novel or film, and in terms of what they do, very broadly, what I would say is each of them individually then elevate and complexify the character and their motivations. They find extra meaning in lines or put new meaning on lines, and then what I do is try to give as much space for that to happen as possible. As long as the intention of the scene is maintained, then I'm really quite relaxed about the direction it goes. And then it would depend on the actor. So Gina Rodriguez, for example, has worked a lot in television, and in television scripts are often changed and then re-delivered in very different forms the night before shooting or even on the day of shooting. So she was very, very good and comfortable with ad-libbing. And so part of what Gina did was to kind of freeform slightly around her character and add lines that I wouldn't have written. But are none the worse for that, in fact, are the better for that. And other actors like to hold very much to the exact words, but find their space within them. I would say Natalie Portman was more like that. She likes the precision, but then also needs space to explore within that. So I guess that, if that is a good answer, I hope.
One thing I found really unique about Annihilation was this feeling of being in this immersive audiovisual experience. The soundtrack particularly was kind of haunting and terrifying, but intriguing. I think it plays on some of the points that you mentioned earlier about your intentions for the film. I was wondering if Free Fire, I think that's the musical duo behind the soundtrack, if they had any plans of touring or putting on any shows. I would be interested in seeing that as a concert.
I'll tell them. It's two guys, Jeff Barrow and Ben Salisbury. They did Free Fire, and they also did the score for Ex Machina, and they're doing something now. Their background, Ben worked on nature documentaries, and he had a kind of technical understanding of cues and where to bring them in and how to use them as a bed and where to make them swell and stuff like that. And Jeff is in bands. Jeff has two bands, one is Portishead and the other is called Beak. And if you want to go and see them, they do gigs. So buy a ticket, turn up, there you go. They're really interesting composers from my point of view because their background is not cinema. They've done a few now. There's a thing that happens in film, which is people get the kind of enthusiasm kicked out of them, beaten out of them, and they get their heart broken because they do a beautiful bit of work that doesn't end up in the film. And after that's happened a few times, that's kind of distressing. It sort of hurts people, burns them, and they arrived with so much enthusiasm and innocence, really. That they're brave, you know, they're brave in what they do. They don't know the old tricks, you know.
And quite fun, yeah.
Hey, I was wondering, in a process of writing something like Annihilation, where you are doing it from your memory, even though there are pages upon it that you could read into for descriptions. You know, when you're writing a script and you want as much white space on the page as possible, you don't want to overburden the reader by describing something wonderful like we see in the film. How do you convey that it's beautiful without going into a 5-paragraph description of it?
Basically, exactly as you did it. As you just stated it. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, I went to a talk with James Seamus, who's a scriptwriter, and Ang Lee, who's a director, and the two of them had worked a great deal together, and they were talking about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and somebody asked essentially that question to James Seamus about how you script those fight sequences, and he said he wrote "they fight." Then it gets handed to everybody. Stunt supervisors, camera people, production designers, everybody, the director, everyone. And it grows out of that collaboration. And Same with that. Not that. The previous one, with the sort of petrol, gasoline, shimmery colours and stuff like that. I think it said something in the script like a weird liquid effect of rainbow colours. That's it. Then you've got to figure it out.
Yeah, so I teach and I taught your book, The Beach, and a lot of my students are immigrants, so they started to see the whole story as a parable of immigration and assimilation and what happens to you and why it works and why it doesn't. And I was wondering, since you talked about subjectivity, if that was at all your intention or if that was really what they brought to the text.
No, it wasn't. I'd love to be able to lay claim to those kind of smart, cool things, but it really wasn't. In The Beach, it was more... so to give an idea of the way I was thinking about it, which, as I said previously, is not to diminish the other way of thinking about it, it was about using a country, an entire country, as like a kind of backdrop. Something like a Disneyland for people in late adolescence or early 20s, and how people and palm trees were kind of indistinguishable as backdrop. It was that.
Maybe one more question? There's another? Yeah, up here.
Yeah, just speak directly.
My question is, what is your collaborative process like with your DOPs? And would you consider yourself more concerned with the framing, or do you feel like you're indebted to your actors?
Not indebted to anybody as a priority. I mean, you have to capture what they're doing. But in terms of the specifics of the question, what's the relationship with the DOP? It's like this. This is exactly what it is. At the start of a day, there's a quick rehearsal. There've been more extensive rehearsals before shooting, so the actors have a sense of why they're doing it or the way they want to do it or whatever it happens to be. But on the day, you block it. So you're figuring out, or the actors are figuring out, everyone's figuring out when they're going to stand up, sit down, the sort of specifics of the scene. After you've rehearsed, which is just me and the actors, you do a lineup and everybody in the crew comes in and watches it, so that everybody involved in making the film on that day understands what they are going to be doing in relation to what the actors are doing. And then, in front of the crew and in front of the actors, I make a point of doing this. I turn to Rob, who is the DOP on the last two films I've shot with him, and say, Rob, how do you want to shoot it? So the first thing I do is I want to find out what the expert, the gifted expert in shooting, what he thinks is the right thing to do. And most of the time, his first thoughts are going to be what you see in the movie. There's a discussion that comes from that, like, well, what about this angle? Or why don't we start pushing in here? Or, all right, halfway through the day, fuck that, let's try something else. But the starting point is to ask the director of photography how he wants to direct the photography. There's other look, there are people who direct films who in a way, what they really are is DOPs themselves. And what they say is, stick on a 35, put the track there, get rid of that light, put a flag over there, and they do that. You know, there isn't a cookie cutter sort of approach that you can apply to the whole thing, but that's what I do.
So